Hello and welcome to the EchoChamber podcast. My name's Tony Groves, and today we're subject to some FOIs, Martin. Me and you, and I don't think you're going to pass, mate.
Freedom of information. All information should be free.
Yeah. How many times do you're the only person I know who Googles his name more than Donald Trump does, apparently.
I've Googled it in ages. There's an American doctor with the same name. He's kind of famous, but I'm more handsome, so that works out.
Yoda. But much more importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack by Principal at FP Logue Solicitors, specialist in technology, intellectual property and information law and commercial law, Fred Logue. Fred, this is not to start you off on a bad thing, but we put Ken Fox on a pedestal in here, and we have him right up the tippity top. And he actually said to me one day, "Oh no, Fred is the expert." So where was Ken? I said, "Where was Fred?"
I say Ken taught me everything I know about FOI. I have to say that.
Yeah.
So, Ken is my collaborator.
Yeah.
I work with a client called Right to Know. So Ken and Gavin Sheridan run that, and is Ireland's only, I think, transparency NGO.
And it's a fabulous thing, and always looking for funding. And you're on Twitter and you're on Facebook as well. So if anybody wants to donate, jump in and donate.
Right to know.ie.
And it's and you can give on a monthly basis or give an annual subscription.
Yeah, but that's the plug done. Carry on.
I would donate to the Tortoise Shack before you donate to Right to Know. I have to say that.
Thank you.
I can talk about Right to Know. I met Gavin maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I was at a bit of a loose end, and he was doing lots of FOIs, so I started helping him out on the legal stuff. And the first kind of big case we took was against NAMA in 2013. I can't remember the exact year. But NAMA had just been set up. It was not under FOI, but we found that there's these European laws called Access to Environmental Information, which apply to entities irrespective of what the Irish government decides. So Gavin put in a request for some environmental information to NAMA. NAMA told him to take a hike, that they weren't subject to any of these laws, and he appealed through the Commissioner for Environmental Information, who found that NAMA was subject to these laws. NAMA then turned around and appealed through the courts, and through several years of hand-to-hand combat with NAMA, we came out the other end, and the Supreme Court said, yes, NAMA is obviously a public authority and has to answer these requests. And actually, in the meantime, NAMA was then brought within FOI anyway. So that was the first big case, and it showed the power of litigation for NGOs, for small people who want to develop the law, who want to open up big state bodies, want to make public life more transparent. And then the second kind of big thing we worked on was the Trichet letters.
Yes.
I should remember that.
Yes.
So the quote allegedly attributed to Jean-Claude Trichet was that a bomb would go off in Dublin if Ireland didn't take the bailout voluntarily. Yeah. And the suspicion was that the ECB had written a letter to the Irish state or to the government to say that voluntarily apply for the bailout or else.
Yeah.
And this is all denied both by the Irish side and by the ECB. But if you listen to some of the interviews at the time, and they're on YouTube, you can hear Brian Lenihan and Dan O'Brien actually describing what happened around that time. And it seemed clear to us that there was actually these letters that weren't being disclosed, that weren't admitted to, and that did have some explosive content from the ECB. So the ECB naturally refused on the basis that if they released this letter, that would destabilise the Eurozone. It was so serious. And we pointed out that similar letters in for example, Spain or Italy had already been disclosed or leaked or whatever, and that the world was still functioning, that the ATMs were still working. But that didn't cut any mustard with them. So we in this case, we made a complaint to the European Ombudsman, who at that time, or still is, an Irish person, Emily O'Reilly, who was former Information Commissioner. And through the heel of the hunt, she said that ECB was justified in refusing access to the letter at the time. But with the passage of time and the stabilisation of the financial crisis, that
the contagion was then controlled, so it was okay to
let this toxic information out into the wild.
Yeah.
And in true Irish journalistic style, the day before the ECB released it, it was leaked to the Irish Times by the Department of Finance.
Yeah.
we have an awful habit of these things happening, don't we?
Yeah, it seems to be standard operating procedure.
And was the letter as damning as you had hoped?
Yes, there is a line. You can go on to the story.ie and you'll see it. And there's a line in there which essentially says the Irish state needs to take the money from the pension reserve fund and bail out the banks, and it has to take a bailout package from the ECB and the IMF.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. But luckily for us, Enda Kenny in 2011 campaigned that he'd go over and he'd get the debt reduced, and he got the debt reduced, and we're all very happy now and moving forward.
It's as if it never happened.
And it is funny in the greater context, because if you remember some of the stuff about Spain at the time, it was really interesting because their stuff did come out and they were much more robust, shall we say, Spain, Italy, Portugal, in their kickback of accepting general terms and conditions, and some of the deals that we did subsequently to this were just as a consequence of belligerence in other EU countries, even though it was okay for Enda to go away and say, well, I've come back and I've renegotiated the deal. Well, we simply just got the benefit of the belligerence of our other fellow recalcitrant children.
Well, there's probably a reason why there's no word for cojones in Irish.
we had Derek from the Irish 4 on. I must tweet him later and find out if he can get us one.
In the world of pigs, we're the curly tail that curls up under the arse. We always will be. Well,
it's interesting because I'll talk about vulture funds later on, and the way it's panned out in Spain is actually a good. It's a good contrast with the way it's panning out in Ireland. And in Spain, you'll see that the Spanish courts have actually imposed judgments on the Spanish banks that have cost them billions in unenforceable mortgage terms, whereas in Ireland, the courts are looking the other way, let's just say, on some of the clauses in the mortgage contracts that are letting people be evicted from their homes and letting vulture funds.
Well, I think there's no point in even putting it off. We can get into it now, because the reality is, I've spoken to the Master of the High Court, Ed Honan, and he said people come in and the presumption is the judge doesn't get any information up front. He's just told this person hasn't paid X. There's no, the bank is there to represent, and the person quite often is told you don't even need to attend. So they're not even, some of them aren't even encouraged to put forward a defence. But it could be, whatever there's cases of illness, there's cases of employment terms being, lessened or whatever it is. But the assumption immediately starts with the contract has been broken in the bank's favour. And we know now, given what's happened in the last few months, that there is actually a big ramping up in the number of proceedings that have commenced in the high courts.
Yeah, so I listened to what the Master had to say, and I actually agree with almost everything he said. And some of these bills that are before the Dáil or languishing in the Dáil just state what the law is at the moment. There's nothing actually new in it. It's EU consumer and human rights law. But the problem is that the justice system has not adapted itself to the circumstance of having thousands and thousands of possession cases before it. So the procedures aren't there. The registrars and the circuit court judges, most of whom are doing a very noble job in trying to give debtors a bit of room and space to actually work out a deal with the banks or the lenders. But ultimately, their hands are tied behind their backs, that they have to give an order for possession if a bank looks for it. And there's no procedure to check the contract. There's no procedure to allow the debtor to tell the court about its circumstances and things like that. And there's no guidelines in the law to say what needs to be taken into account and what shouldn't be taken into account. So it's a bare summary procedure that says if you haven't paid back your mortgage or the amount is due, you can go to court and get an order for possession, and that's all it says. So straight off, that's a breach of European human rights law, which says that if there's an interference with your home, that you should be able to consult the law and to see what the parameters are that make the difference between you staying in your home and getting kicked out of it. But there's nothing in our law that documents that. So an ordinary person is going into a court and they don't know what they're supposed to say or what evidence they're supposed to give. And that's a clear breach of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union and the European Convention of Human Rights. So the second thing, I think, which the Master didn't really dwell on is that these are consumer contracts. So European law gives special protection to consumers in the case where the contract is a pre-drafted contract and is non-negotiable and is unfair. And it's called the Unfair Terms in Consumer Contracts Directive. And what that says is that if a term is unfair, it's unenforceable. And so what unfair means that there has been a breach of a duty of good faith by the supplier to the duty of good faith.
In this case, by the provider of the mortgage to the...
Yeah, by the bank, essentially.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if any of your listeners have actually read their mortgage contracts, but I think everyone who's listening to this should go out and ask their bank for a copy of their contract. There's a legal obligation to give it to you, actually, and read it and see what it says. And there are terms in there that are absolutely shocking. They will shock you. For example, if you have a joint mortgage with your spouse and your spouse dies, the bank can call in your mortgage.
Yep.
If you rent out your house, the bank can call in your mortgage. If you breach planning law, say you put an extension on without planning permission, the bank can call in your mortgage. They can go into your house and do work on your house without your permission. They can sell the contract to whoever they want without even telling you about it. It's so one-sided that you'd be shocked.
Oh, you would actually. I wouldn't, but there you go.
Well, you've obviously been around, but most ordinary, decent people.
You wouldn't, but the balance. It's not even an imbalance. It's totally weighted in favour of the banks.
Yeah.
And then of course the full recourse to in the event of everything going.
Yeah.
So how long have our powers that be known that this anomaly exists and have done nothing about it?
Well, the directive is a 1993 directive. So we've had it for the best part of 20 years.
Is that all?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that explains it for 20 years. We need longer.
You got to remember, in that time frame, to put it in context, we had we created the Financial Services Ombudsman. This office that was around College Green that was going to put manners on the banks when credit was flowing. We had that been subsumed into the central bank. We had the central bank talking about things that learnings from the crash, and then we've only seen recently where the central bank produced its own report at Pascal Donoghue's behest, where they said that they haven't actually taken any learnings, and the culture is still. I don't use the word. I'm going to use the word toxic, but that was. It was. If you read the report, it was actually a scary thing, and I'm going to then have a kick back at the mainstream, because I remember in the exact report where RTE reported it, they finished with a comment from the new chief executive of Bank of Ireland, who spoke about her value system and how she was going to impose this. And I just thought, oh my God, I understand you get a lot of sponsorship from the banks, but please stop giving me fair and balanced nonsense.
So there's one clause in nearly every contract that is crucial, and that's called the acceleration clause, which basically says if you miss one or two payments, the full amount of your mortgage becomes due immediately, which is fine. That's on its own is not a problem. But if you try and pay back those missed payments, that doesn't actually cure the fact that the full amount has now become due, and that's why it's unfair. So, say something goes wrong at my bank, or I get sick, or somebody writes a check on my account and there's no money in it, and I miss a payment. That means that the bank can now call in your loan and get possession of your house, even if you pay back what you owe them, plus interest, plus expenses. And the second thing is that most contracts have, or even the older ones anyway, have an interest variation clause that lets the bank set whatever interest rate it wants, which means that a bank in theory can rack up your interest rate to such an extent that you can't pay your loan, so that you miss a payment and therefore can call in your loan and take your house off you. That is fundamentally unfair. Now, the reason why that's important is because, if that clause is unfair, and the indications are that it is, because there is EU case law on it, that means that the banks lose the ability to seek an order for possession. Because an order for possession is only allowed where the full amount of the loan has become due. So if the clause that triggers that becomes unenforceable, then the possession remedy becomes unenforceable. But that doesn't mean you don't owe the money. But what it means is they have to go the normal ordinary debt route, which means that their mortgage debt now joins the queue behind everything else, behind the car loan, behind the credit cards, behind the college debt.
It goes into the pile.
It goes into the pile, and they'll never see it, or it increases the cost of enforcement. So that's great. We have EU law. Sure, why don't we just go to court and have it enforced, you might think.
Yes.
That's easier said than done.
Clearly.
So our circuit courts are not equipped to do this. Well, and I should say that there's what's called a known motion assessment duty on courts, and that through case law, the ECJ has said that because there's such an imbalance between a consumer and a supplier, that to remedy that imbalance, the court of its own motion, i.e. without being asked, when there's a consumer dispute before it, it has to read the contract and identify any unfair terms. And if there are unfair terms, it has to strike them out from the contract and not enforce them. And then once it's done that, it can rule on the remedy. And there's two aspects to that. Firstly, it ensures that unfair terms are not enforced against consumer. And secondly, it has this preventative aspect in that over time, as courts do this over a period of time,
the contracts,
that unfair terms will gradually be phased out.
Yeah.
But we're here today where unfair terms are not being looked at, it's not being identified by courts, and we are creating a new generation of mortgage holders who have exactly the same contracts as the previous generation. And presumably in 10 years' time, they will then be in possession proceedings on these unfair contracts. So the courts are failing in their duty to the individual debtor, and they're failing in their duty to society at large.
Why are they failing this way?
I think it's the big lie that that naturally judges can't be unaware of the consequences of their decisions. And it seems clear to me that if one of these clauses gets kicked out of the mortgage contracts, and they're in every single contract they're the same, that this will disrupt the mortgage market. And I can actually quote from a judgment. I brought it with me. It's from a case, McMahon, and the judge in this case in the High Court says to suggest that the unfair terms, regulations of the directive apply to a deed of mortgage itself is, in my view, an absurd proposition, which, if accepted, might very well undermine the domestic mortgage market. So the courts are putting the domestic mortgage market ahead of EU law.
Okay, my totally ignorant head. So the law is actually now acting on behalf of a mortgage market and not on behalf of the consumer who's there before them.
And it was always thus. It was the mortgage contract law was put in front of, as you've rightly put out, human rights law and human rights. These things were not taken into account. So, the length of tenure you were in that property isn't taken into account. These things that actually, even if I want to go macro and talk about the UN's right to adequate housing, these sort of things are not actually taken into effect because it's a simple contract. Decision, judgment. Yeah.
Well, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people shouldn't have their houses possessed if they don't pay their mortgage, but it should be done according to the law. And it is a contractual matter. And if the contract isn't enforceable, that's tough. Yeah. The banks are huge, massive corporations with hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. They can hire the top law firms in the country. AIB has enough solicitors to fill 3 law firms. Yeah. So they can't say they don't know about it. For a court to say that it's absurd that this law applies in this way because it might disrupt the market, I think is very dangerous, to be honest. And
when you bring it forward, you then understand how the danger we face is actually, it's bigger than that, because the danger we now face is we have, say for example, if you're part of a recent tranche of loans that have been sold to a vulture fund, and you've had that problem where you've missed a couple of repayments, but you entered a restructure policy. You adhered to the terms and conditions. You thought you'd exited. After 3 years, you've now got a deal where you're actually servicing that debt, and now you've been sold to a vulture fund.
Yeah.
And they still have, under the contract, they can call in that debt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the suspicion is that the vulture funds are buying the loans for less than the houses are worth. And ultimately, it's the house they're after, and that's how they make their profit. So that's TBD. We don't really know what the strategy is, but it's hard to imagine that they're going to make profits on monthly repayments over the lifetime of a mortgage.
Yes.
Not interested in servicing.
No, because that's traditional banking. I don't see any vulture fund.
I mean, vulture funds are there to sweat the assets, get the money out and move on.
And then the residual debt will be sold on. I think we saw in the paper this week or last week, kind of residual debtor having private investigators called to her house at the middle of the night.
Yeah.
Interrogations, kind of harassment. So the other thing I'd say is, like in Spain, the courts have taken the leap, and the Supreme Court has made calls on. There's a Spanish clause called a floor clause, which meant that the interest rate couldn't go below a certain level, irrespective of what the underlying rates were, and ultimately that was found to be unfair, and that clause becoming unenforceable has cost the Spanish banking system in the region of €5 billion in terms of they've had to charge lower interest rates than
and our interest rates here we have double the interest rates of the EU average here, so I mean, we're already getting screwed.
Yeah, but there's two sides to that. Okay, so the EU has in effect, if you can get interest rates in Spain, you can get it is a tracker rate. You can track your Euribor. You won't track the ECB rate, but you track the interbank rate. You can get these historically low interest rates as a consumer. We don't get that. But on the flip side, I sat at a conference with Sergio Ansari from Valencia, who said, 48 million people and what was it? 23,000 homeless people.
Yeah, their percentage of homeless is way less than ours. Way less.
Yeah. Well, that's the consequence, because there's nothing. If you get your house possessed, there's no safety net for most people, for nobody, as far as I can see. So it's an all or nothing kind of scenario that you can't look at it and say, well, I can't pay my mortgage, I'll fall back on the state, because there is no fallback.
But surely there's one arm of the state somewhere which is not complicit in this. I'd like to meet that arm if it exists. Like the way I look at it, this is a scandal of the same proportion as the Magdalene laundries, that you have people being denied their basic rights under EU law, under human rights law, under the Constitution even, and that it seems like every arm of the state is colluding or looking the other way, and nobody really wants to know about it, and that in the years to come, when we see the fallout in terms of suicide, cancer, mental illness, breakup of families, and the effect it'll have on people's children, people who've had to, it's disrupted their kids' college education, and all these knock-on things. And when we come back to look at the history of it, we will look again at our justice system, at the government administration, at the police, and to say, how could they have dispossessed so many people of their houses without at least doing the basic checks and doing it in accordance with the law? And the result is the same. The poor get warehoused. It's the exact same. And again, it's affecting predominantly women and children. They're the ones suffering most in this.
Well, in the growth of homelessness, we know it's predominantly women and children. But we also know that there's the buy-to-lets that are affected in the mortgage market. They're predominantly, families that are on low incomes as well, that are in tenuous rental conditions, and then they're one vacant possession, and all of a sudden you've another spike in what is a national. You're right, actually, to point out the fact that we're bottling up so many problems that we're just going to see down the line. We've seen evidence of it already. How female suicide has actually increased at a rate never seen before in the state.
Yeah, and I've seen it in my own clients in terms of cancer, family or marriage breakdown, mental illness. You can see it, and it is happening, and it's very real. So all of the kind of PR about, strategic defaulters or people don't want to pay back their mortgage, all that kind of stuff is not true in my experience. And the thing is, what's happened though is there's a kind of psychological effect. So people have been let stay in this limbo for so long now, for 10 years effectively or more, that they actually believe themselves that it'll just keep going like this. So they kind of give up hope. So they do actually think at some level that they'll be able to stay in their houses. And, they haven't been done any favours by being left in this state for 10 years.
No.
And that's like half of your working life, or a quarter of your working life. So, and it has a really deep psychological effect on people. And it's very hard to describe the effect it has. It's not rational. Just the pure stress, the uncertainty, the lack of hope. And, there's hundreds of thousands of people who are not economically active in this country, and could be if the debt situation at the consumer level was resolved.
But as the master pointed out, he said some of that was at the state's door, because they promised, the sort of the insolvency service, and then they promised that they'd sort out the mortgage to rent schemes and things like that. But none of those have actually really sorted out they haven't progressed people on into different stages, whether it was becoming insolvent or it was becoming a tenant in their home or whatever. It just didn't move on.
Yeah, and the banks have vetoes over a lot of that.
You said it, I know that.
Yeah, so that's another point. The state shouldn't intervene to order possession of somebody's home if there's a less intrusive way of solving it. So the bank can veto the insolvency arrangement, or can veto the mortgage to rent. But if it vetoes it, it shouldn't be entitled to an order for possession. That's clearly the case, that there's a proportionality test has to be done, and the order for possession should only be if it's strictly necessary to give effect to the bank's rights. And
we know that the mortgage to rent numbers are minuscule.
And I think that's part of the reason. And the other thing, there's a kind of gap between the mortgage to rent level of debtor and the insolvency level. So those people are kind of stuck in the middle. So they don't earn enough for an insolvency scheme, but they earn too much for the mortgage to rent. And there's a lot of people in that area as well. And the thing is, this could have been solved, as maybe on one of the previous podcasts, by having a program to offer the loans back to people to buy at the same cost as they were sold to the vultures.
Yes.
People are now turning around, they're working again, they're earning money, and there are a lot of people who could actually come to some kind of arrangement to restructure at that level. So the banks would get exactly the same amount of money. So you can't argue that the bank's balance sheets are threatened. People have got stability back in their lives, and they're economically active again. So society benefits. And then something, the rest you can't do it, have to either decide to be vulture funds or whether some other kind of scheme. But there's a huge swath of people out there who could have bought their loans back at the price they were sold for.
And I think that was pointed out quite clearly, that we never actually went it's funny, we often make accusations of the Fine Gael government of being the free market dictates, but they never open any of these loans in reality to the free market. We had a situation whereby we had the Minister for Finance, Michael Noonan, meet with Cerberus the day before Project Eagle deal was struck. I'm just completely flabbergasted that to this day that is not even, there's something not said about that. If I'm doing a mortgage for a TD, that person is a PEP. He's a politically exposed person. I have to tread carefully. I have to document everything I've said. I have to minute the bloody conversation. And it could be just a simple thing that he wanted to buy a car. Now, this was people's, family homes and bundles of loans, and I think the value of the actual was 3.5 billion or something of loans in this, and we don't even have documents of what actually occurred on that day.
Absolutely, and I think it's connected back to the legal position, and we saw it in the paper again at the weekend that the central bank and the Department of Finance are worried about some of the bills that are before the Dáil to regularise the possession system, and they're worried that that would jeopardise the ability of banks to sell loans to vulture funds. Now, the really worrying thing about that is the central bank is supposed to be the consumer protection regulator for financial services. So you'd have to wonder why they're taking this position and what consumer considerations they've taken into account in reaching that position. Because as far as I can tell, the ECB isn't telling the banks to sell to vulture funds. It's telling the banks to clean up their balance sheet, and it's leaving the precise methodology of how to do that to the Irish state. So why isn't the central bank advocating for a scheme that is the most favourable to consumers? And even if you think about it, if you have a scheme that gets people out of the possession treadmill, that will have a knock-on effect on the economy.
Of course,
absolutely.
It'll reduce homelessness. It'll get people back working. It'll stabilise people. It'll benefit rural Ireland. A lot of these people are in rural Ireland where the prices were way above what they should have been. I've clients in Roscommon and Offaly, Laois, Longford, all these places where houses were 3 or 4 times what they were worth, and they will never get back to what they were worth, unlike, say, Dublin or Cork or Galway or whatever. And it just doesn't make either economic sense or legal sense or anything. And
it's inhumane.
It's inhumane, and it's hard to rationalise or explain.
So what's the way forward?
Well, I think there will have to be a case to get as far as the Supreme Court and possibly as far as Luxembourg to actually decide this, because I think the penny has dropped that the unfair terms analysis has to be done. Penny has dropped now. There's been a couple of judgments from one judge in particular. So the latest wheeze now is that because you had a solicitor when you took out your mortgage, that makes all of the unfair terms disappear because the solicitor explained everything.
Doing conveyancing and just...
Yeah, but there's a few problems with that. Firstly, even if I was Gandalf, I would not be able to negotiate that mortgage.
Yeah.
And the crux is it's pre-prepared, standard terms, and it's non-negotiable. So nobody negotiates their mortgage. If there's anyone out there who's negotiated their mortgage on a normal house, I'd like to meet that person. So solicitor, no solicitor. Tom Cruise in the firm.
No one buys a mortgage. No one buys a mortgage. They want to buy bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
The mortgage is just this contract that gets them on the road. People don't come in and want. Can I see that bit of paper, please?
From my memory, the solicitor was the guy who put the little pointed stickers where I sign.
Yeah.
That's what.
They don't do that anymore. But and then the second thing is, when a solicitor certifies your mortgage, it expressly says on the certificate that the solicitor has not looked at the unfair terms. It actually says it. So this thing about a solicitor somehow curing unfair terms is just completely incorrect.
Nonsense. Yeah.
Who's letting that particular piece of flotsam around?
Well, there's a few High Court judgments on that.
Okay.
And including this one, McMahon, and Cosgrave is another one.
So the only way forward really is the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so what we're essentially saying is the usual, Ireland is different.
Yeah.
There's something so unique about our legal system that we don't have unfair terms in mortgage contracts in Ireland. It's impossible because of solicitors working some kind of magic that they turn this non-negotiable.
And do you remember around 06 when you could when everybody was switching mortgages and it was £1,000 of your legal fees and it was literally it was rubber stamping conveyancing. It was the triple X sign here and here.
Yeah.
And have you got your family home declaration?
Yeah.
Sign here. Out you go.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but it just doesn't hold up. That is not the reality of what was going on and is going on.
Yeah.
But on the wider EU or on the wider European issue, this doesn't fly. It just simply doesn't fly. It doesn't fly in Spain.
Yeah.
It doesn't fly in other countries.
Yeah.
But somehow we're different.
And every other country has a different flavour of it. So the Eastern European countries, they made them take out their mortgages in hard currencies like Swiss francs, and then the local currency now has collapsed. So there's all sorts of things about how to calculate the exchange rate, whether this was fair, whether that was unfair. So everyone has their own flavour. But I find it hard to believe that Ireland is so unique that these absolutely impenetrable contracts that are written in 19th century English are somehow fair because a solicitor was there when he signed it. So that is not what the Unfair Terms Directive says. And it's crystal clear. And I think that it's also crystal clear that the acceleration clause is grossly unfair. Because if I'm a £5 short on my payment, and even if I pay back that £5, the bank can still call in my loan.
It's just unusual to say that, because twice in recent weeks I've seen this situation where a person in a building society, their mortgage hasn't been paid because the cost of the card for taking money out of the wall, that there's a duty on that has to be paid to the government, and it's taken automatically, and the mortgage was then short and wasn't paid. Twice in the last couple of weeks I've seen that. So you're saying that situation could lead to accelerated terms? In
certain circumstances, yeah. Now the banks will say, well, we didn't actually accelerate, but that's not, so the principle is, it's not how you apply the clause, it's what the clause says. And even if you don't actually apply the clause, or you apply it in a way that would have been fair, if that's what it said, that doesn't make any difference. The clause is still unfair by the very fact that you could have done it in that way. And therefore it has to be struck out from the contract. And then you read the contract without that clause. And so the bank has to identify another clause that entitles it to call in the loan.
That'd be a great exercise to actually get your mortgage terms and then strike out all the ones you think are unfair and see what's left.
Probably a very, very, very short piece of paper.
Oh, that would be interesting. That would be very interesting.
I've done it for a few, and they're exceptionally one-sided. There's literally nothing in there that the bank can't do. They can sign documents on your behalf without telling you. If any issue around the calculation of the charges, the interest, how much is due, the interpretation of the contract, their signed certificate is definitive, so they can decide how the contract is interpreted, even if it's adverse to you. They were drafted in another era. And because we haven't applied the unfair terms in our justice system, these unfair terms are just continuing, and they keep continuing to this day.
Speaking of another era, and I am going to digress a little bit, the presidency has a problem around FOI.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and we've seen that in terms of, and I know we're going to mention Ken for the umpteenth time, but I know he was quite agitated, and it wasn't done on Michael D's behest, but it is an issue whereby he's exempt from FOI. I mean,
it's more than that. Any record relating to the president is exempt from FOI. So it's broader than him or his office personally. Now, that being said, there's been a recent Information Commissioner decision that says that the Secretary General to the President is subject to FOI. So that's a new departure. And I think we're seeing as well with the election and the exposure people are thinking about the President, that there is a bit more thought being put to actually, well, should the President be subject to FOI? And obviously I say that they should.
Of course.
And like FOI is not an open book law. There are protections in there. So anything to do with national security, international relations, confidential information, private information, it's all protected. So it doesn't mean that we can go in and look at everything that Michael D. Higgins or his office has.
Well, likewise, if it's sensitive material, things can be redacted.
Like the Taoiseach is subject to FOI, so why not the President? And the second thing is that under this access to environmental information law that I mentioned about NAMA, that the way that works is that it describes bodies that are subject to the access right in functional terms, not in specific terms.
Okay.
So there's nothing in there that says the President can't be susceptible to it. So, which Right to Know has put in a couple of requests relating to the President and relating to the Secretary General of the President and relating to the Council of State, which is kind of advises the President. And they're working their way through the system. But surprisingly, just before somewhere, I'm not sure if Ken mentioned this, the government published a new order, a new SI, explicitly accepting the President, the Council of State, the Secretary General to the President, and the Presidential Commission, which is a body that fills the gap if the President is he's out of the country or between presidents. Right. So, for example, when Mary Robinson resigned, and before her, replacement was elected, the Presidential Commission sat. So the EU law just says that, the government or government departments are subject to this access rules. But it says that you can accept bodies for which there's no constitutional review by the courts.
Okay.
So it's debatable about the president whether
he's covered by that.
So that environmental law is actually a clever piece of kit. It cracks an egg, and once you've proved the theory that as a body it's subject to FOI, well, it kind of knocks away the crutches then from the government for their reasons for saying it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're transparent for environmental purposes, why not be transparent for everything?
Yes,
as the argument goes. It's not going to harm you. And like Michael D. Higgins himself is very interested in climate change, for example.
Yeah.
Like he gave a speech at the Paris COP 3 or 4 years ago. He's given speeches on climate change regularly. He's asked to review climate litigation or climate legislation and whether it's constitutional or not.
Yes.
And even down to things like how much weed killer does he spray on his lawn. there are things that we should know about the presidency. How much energy does he use? What kind of transport does he take? And people should be able to see these things and weigh up whether or not he's doing the right thing towards the environment.
Well, ultimately, I think, this is not at all saying that Michael D isn't. We're just purely saying that transparency is what actually matters here. It's the cold hard reality.
Well, everything is taxpayers' money, and by taxpayer I mean everybody, because we all pay tax, and we have a right to know how our money is spent.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a right to know how the state is treating the environment.
Yes.
Yeah.
And,
which is interesting in given the, we're talking about carbon taxes being increased in the budget, but we know that they're not ring fencing them they just go into general taxation, and we've done damn all in terms of actually, real successes in reducing emissions. So it is interesting.
Well, I think the minister came out there 2 weeks ago to say that the National Mitigation Plan has to be redrawn. That it wasn't fit for purpose, which is quite a strong statement.
Yeah.
There is already a case that's going through the courts challenging the National Mitigation Plan as not being fit for purpose, and the government has failed in its duty to produce a plan that will guarantee that we'll meet our targets of 2050.
And did you see the amounts that can fall due? I mean, if we had gotten to the situation where we were told that if we didn't pay our water bills, we were facing fines. The EU fines on a daily rate, I think, were 37,000 euro per day.
Yeah.
The actual equivalent in carbon is up to 1.25 million euro per day.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to, I'm using whataboutery and I shouldn't, but nonetheless, the point is that it's not a minor thing we're talking about here.
No, and I think the penny has dropped again in the population at large that climate change is the defining issue of our time.
Yeah.
Like my 10-year-old son said he wouldn't sleep one night because he's worried about climate change. And so if kids are understanding it and at that level, it means that climate change is now a mainstream issue. And I think the penny has dropped. I'd say there's probably a conflict in the administration between those civil servants and those departments that want to do the right thing, and some of the other ones that are penny pinching or invested in oil exploration or agriculture, for example, or oil-based transport, air travel, for example. And there's a conflict internally, but the rubber will hit the road when the fines kick in. And actually, even worse, we're behind in our renewable targets.
Yeah.
So we will have to buy renewable credits, and they're actually from the rest of Europe, and they're much scarcer than carbon targets and whatever. So
isn't it funny though how we talk now in terms of how we've created a market for buying for assuaging? Yes. You're not doing your job, but we can buy credits. It is an awful, like we've seen people who bought carbon credits only to discover that the credits they purchased were keeping indigenous people off lands because no, those lands are now protected for carbon credits.
It's kind of like when they said that 1 in every 10 houses built was going to be social housing, and they let people buy their way out of it, and now we're in this god-awful mess.
1 in every 5.
Yeah, and now we're in this god-awful mess, and it's the same thing with the credits, the exact same thing.
Well, in fairness to Fianna Fáil, in their day, and I suppose compared to what we've experienced in the last 10 years, they weren't that bad. I know it kills me to say it.
Oh, it's awful, isn't it?
Yeah,
but they're the facts.
It's awful, but it's true.
But like people like Noel Dempsey actually did some good stuff in their time, and
it was the rowback that killed him. It was the rowback.
But I suppose nostalgia is a great.
Any young people, you'll never know what it was like. You know?
Well, I don't know. I kind of agree with you. It is worse now, and it's harder for people now. I mean, the prospect of getting onto the property ladder, even if you were nuts enough to try and get onto it now, what will 26% above
income levels,
26%
above affordability. I wrote a piece 2 years ago that showed Ireland was slipping into San Francisco and Tokyo levels of unaffordability. We're actually there now. We're in that, in the class affordability indies, and they go to unaffordable, then seriously unaffordable. We've gone right over into that, and we were, we kind of knew we were tipping into that last year. We were already getting there. There was an interesting thing today where the RTE reported that the level of growth had slowed, but it was still 3 times the rate of inflation. Yeah. So you're not making any progress. It was the scenario where it was reported as things are getting worse at a slower rate.
Oh yeah. Soft landing.
Yeah.
But actually, if you look at the National Development Plan, National Planning Framework, the only kind of discernible goal in that is to increase the population by approximately 1 million people over the next 20 years. And that is in the face of having to drastically reduce our carbon emissions, decarbonise our economy, solve our housing crisis, and reorient agriculture towards less carbon intensive.
Fred, you're preaching to the choir. I keep saying to people, you do understand that it means actually some people having less, and we need to have an equalisation. It's going to be very hard to sell that, though. We're not really.
But if you don't sell it, eventually it happens and it's out of control.
Yeah, but if you look at it, like that's happening. Like this year, I think we saw a net increase of 50,000 or 60,000. And if you look pre-crash, the trajectory was going that way anyway. Like between the 80s and the start of the 2000s. The population increased by over 1 million, I think.
Yeah. But imagine now you want to do that in a country where you're telling people that, we have to get away from this model where our GDP is the fastest growing in Europe every year. We actually need to level off these things. And in some cases, we need degrowth in certain industries where we can actually, like you said, we don't have a mentality that's right now. We also don't have a proper opposition that can people can put forward a vision for that. But that's.
I saw that about the population growth, and the bit I took from it, the fastest growing area for population was Fingal. Yes, go on the lads.
Does that mean Dublin are going to keep winning the All-Ireland forever?
I'm literally
the meat man.
I'm going to text Ewan McKenna now and ask can he dial in. We'll get a height.
I live in East Meads, and most of the people there don't realise they're not in Dublin.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the gas season, it's all Dublin flags.
Yeah.
And they're going, lads, this is Meath, not Dublin.
But you're one of those rare people who were born in Meath and live in Meath.
Well, actually, I was born in Malahide.
No one's born in Malahide.
Well, when my parents in the 70s were starting out, Malahide was the starter home. Yeah. It was either Malahide or Clondalkin.
Martin's from Portmarnock, so you're basically neighbours.
Yeah. Came around the same time.
But to say, to finish there, we have a client who is taking a case challenging the National Development Plan on the basis that the environmental assessments haven't been done correctly, and particularly around climate change.
That's interesting.
That if you look at the plan, there's a graph in it that shows our targets going down and our emissions going up.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of hand waving around that.
Yeah.
But obviously, even to the uninitiated, that doesn't look right.
No.
And it also involves commitments to build a new runway at Dublin Airport, which is another case I acted for in client, which we lost, but we actually succeeded in convincing the court that there was an unidentified right to a healthy environment in the Constitution. So all these big issues are coming to pass about, carbon intensive transport, agriculture,
which are our big polluters.
Yeah, fossil fuels, and it's all linked up together. I think it's you can't, from the housing we talked about at the start, environmental issues, even privacy issues, because if things start falling apart, we see surveillance is becoming more pervasive. The guards are seen to be rolling out a number plate network around the country.
Yep.
There's counties are putting up CCTV everywhere and selling it as smart technology or protecting us from whatever.
There's even consultants being followed around by private investigators. Even that happened in
when the doctors are targeted, it's
it's getting serious.
But we end on a lighter note. So how do you lose 68 emails and then from a Department of Justice and a Gmail account,
Well, I suppose it takes a bit of skill. I'm sure Sir Humphrey would have a quote for that. To lose one email is unfortunate or whatever.
Yeah, it's 68.
But I have to say, I have to hand it to the Information Commissioner. On this occasion, they did the right thing and they didn't let the Department of Justice away with it. And I think what it means is that politicians, civil servants, the police, whoever, there has to be some kind of constraint on their use of these email. I can appreciate in certain circumstances, given anyone's knowledge of the public services IT system, which I believe in large part uses Lotus Notes. There's people out there who don't even know what we're talking about. That it can be difficult to operate in that situation.
Yeah.
But
send from your iPad on the bottom of the email is not exactly...
But you can't circumvent. You can't circumvent with your personal email. You just can't.
No, and even that's just, it's not on. That there's nothing in the FOI Act that accepts it. But the problem is there's kind of deferential attitude to politicians, to ministers. So it's a brave civil servant that will go and ask the Taoiseach for access to his Gmail account.
I think it's a braver Taoiseach that will go and ask the civil servant for access to his personal Gmail account.
That's true. But the interesting thing is that, what was I going to say there? It's the classic FOI pincer movement. So when it comes out, they say, it's grand, there was nothing sensitive in it.
Yeah.
FOI, oh no, this is top secret. Couldn't possibly tell you that.
We did a trawl. we did our trawl, and we know there's nothing there. But
then you look for it, and it says it's top secret. It's state secrets. That there'd be gangs of feral youths rampaging around the country if we told you that.
Yeah. Our commercial sensitivity works quite well.
Yeah. Well, deliberations of a public authority is the best one because they're always deliberating. There's never be caught in the same room as decision. Yeah.
Fred, thank you so much for coming in. This has been a really interesting chat. I know, Tony, you enjoyed this.
Yeah, I did, and I think the listeners need to do actually take up the matter, know what is actually what your rights are, and start thinking when you read articles or you read op-eds where people say things like the can't pay brigade or these things. You know what, actually, contract law does not trump human rights, and we need to start thinking about it, because as Fred rightly points out, one, that there are existing laws that should give protections to people, and two, what's happening is actually also, if you're just going to be a mercenary about it, economically incompetent. We're making really bad decisions here.
For the free marketeers, it's not a free market. When you're curtailing one side of the market, it can't be a free market. I mean, consumers are half the free market. The ones are the ones that sell to consumers.
Yeah, well, my philosophy is nobody's above the law. So
he's afraid now. He just looked at you and say, "Oh no, come on! I thought we were mates."
Well, that's one of the principles of our justice system. Sorry,
lads, do head into Right to Know. There's a range of options. You can give a little few bob, or you can subscribe and you can give them a sponsorship. Give them a shout out, because guys, they do great work, and they actually they've opened one or two eyes around here today, and I hope you're all enjoying it now. Talk to you all soon, folks, and Martin, when are we going live?
We're going live on the 28th of this month at 7 p.m. in the Access. There will be some tickets available. Preference will be given to the guests, of course, because the guests make the show. And to our patrons, they'll get first crack at a ticket. But then there will be tickets available afterwards, and Tony's buying everybody drinks down in the Diggers afterwards. That's it.
The Diggers don't take credit cards, mate. Just talk to you all soon, folks. Bye-bye.